This is an interview with Reverend Betty Bock for the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute's Oral History Project. I'm Dr. Horace Huntley. We're presently at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. Today is January 31st, 1997. Reverend Bock, I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to come and sit and talk with me today. And since we've known each other for so long, I was just, you can refer to me as Horace and I'll refer to you as Betty. Whatever you normally do. Just want to start by asking you some background questions. Where are you originally from?
I grew up in Missouri, lived on a farm near the town of Marshall. That was our mailing address.
Marshall, Missouri.
Right.
Where is that in relationship to St. Louis or Kansas City?
It's about halfway between Kansas City and St. Louis, closer to Kansas City. But if you drew a straight line between the two cities, you'd come pretty close to where I live.
Oh, okay. You had how many siblings?
I have one brother.
One brother.
Right.
And is he older or younger?
4 years older than I am.
Okay. Your parents, were they from Missouri?
Yes. The farm that I grew up on, my mother was born there and is now 82 and has lived there all but 2 years of her life.
Is that right? Did you go back often?
Oh, yes. I use all my vacation time to go and see family. My brother lives in St. Louis, and I have a niece there, and a niece in Arizona, and her husband and 2 boys.
So only you decided to come this far south?
Right.
Is that right? Yes. Your father, what kind of, well, let me ask this first of all. Your mother and father, what level of education did they have?
They both, mother had a high school education, and my father dropped out of school when he was in the 4th or 5th grade. His father was hurt in an accident, and he was the oldest of the boys, and it kind of felt his responsibility to take over the farm.
What kind of work did your mother do? Did she work outside of the home?
No, she was a homemaker.
Okay. And your father was a farmer?
Yes.
Okay. Family-owned farm?
Yes.
What did your farm?
Mixed farming, corn, soybeans, wheat, oats, like clover and Lespedusa for hay. And usually we always had some cattle and sometimes had pigs, but always had cattle also.
Did you have the opportunity to work on the farm as well?
You better believe it. I started milking when I was 5 years old.
Is that right?
And when I was 7 or 8, had my first bunch of chickens and saved money for my chickens to buy a cow, and saved my money because I was going to go to college and be a school teacher. So all the money from the calves for my cow went into savings to be able to go to college. Yeah, I knew my parents couldn't help me go to college. If I was going to be able to go, I would have to do it on my own.
So how young did you decide that that's what you had to do?
In the 3rd grade, I had a teacher that I was very, very fond of and wanted to be like her.
What was it like growing up on a farm in Missouri in the 50s and 60s?
Well, we were examples of urban poverty, but I never really realized we were poor because pretty much everybody around me lived in the same circumstances. Went to a 1-room country school the first 3 years. The largest year there were 8 in the school.
8 in your classroom?
No, 8 in the school. I was in the 3rd grade before I had anybody in the same grade with me, and really wasn't sure whether I was going to like that or not.
Is that right?
A little competition there.
Yes. Were there any African Americans in the area that you grew up?
Well, after the 1-room school was closed, there was a consolidated district, but it wasn't until high school that I was in school with any African American individuals. There were 3 in my high school class.
3 in the class.
Right.
High school of what size?
There were 42 in the graduating class.
Big school.
Right.
Yes, yes. What did you do after high school?
Well, I was going to say just a word about the high school experience. One of the big things about high school was that we would go on a senior trip, and my class decided to go to Washington, D.C. And while we were there, went to a restaurant to eat that refused to seat the 2 black students who were with us, and the rest of us immediately got up and walked out. But that was probably my first exposure to racial prejudice, because in the community, they really were a part of the community and everything. So that was probably my first sensitizing to the way life was for a large portion of our country.
What year was this that you were in DC?
1960.
And so that was your first encounter with segregation.
Right.
Because you had not experienced, you had not seen that rear its head
Right.
in your community.
Right.
What about in St. Louis? Did you ever go into St. Louis or Kansas City?
Only times we went to Kansas City was if my mother had some health problems and we would go to a specialist there. We might stop and shop with shoes or something, but it was it was a 125-mile trip, and back in those days, a 125-mile trip was a big deal. So by the time you got there and waited to see the doctor, if you were going to get home to be able to milk the cows and feed the chickens. I can't remember, for example, if I ever going to a restaurant to eat.
That's about the size of with me as well, because I don't think I ever went to a restaurant to eat. I worked in a restaurant, but I never went to a restaurant to eat before I was in the military, I believe.
We would take our lunch along with us.
That's right. We had a standing joke in our family that we would leave Birmingham going to Greene County, and before we would get to Bessemer, my grandmother would always say, "Break out the bag, give me a chicken wing or something." Betty, how active were you in extracurricular activities in your high school?
Not all that active, because I think there really weren't that many things at the school, because most of at least half the students were from farms, and as soon as school was out, you went home because you had responsibilities there. So I really can't recall any extracurricular school activities that I participated in. If you're a boy, you could play basketball or football. Well, I did play in the band. I guess that would be an extracurricular activity.
Just for a minute, when you and your class went to DC, and you all left after your classmates were not served, what kind of discussion went on among you as a result of that?
Initially we were very incensed. We made some suggestions of what we could go back to that restaurant and do in terms of kind of making a scene out of it. And once the anger kind of subsided, the sponsors of the trip, I think, did a good job of bringing us together and just kind of talking about it. Let Bertie and JJ talk about what it felt like for them. And we spent several hours just kind of talking about the experience, and I really credit the teachers for being that insightful to turn something like that into a learning experience that most of it, again, this was our first experience kind of thing, and we just couldn't believe. Bertie had been the star in the senior play. We couldn't believe.
That happened to Bertie.
Yeah,
Yes.
Don't they know who Bertie is?
Right. What did you do after high school?
Went to college at Central Missouri State University. I was about 70 miles from home.
What was that transition like from high school to college?
Couldn't believe where all these people had come from. The initially, my first year was really a big adjustment to those kind of surroundings. I really had led a very sheltered life in terms of being exposed to just the things about the world. Because finances were so tight for me, the college had a house that had been converted into a cooperative living house where there were 4 kitchens and there were 8 of us to a kitchen, and we did our own cooking, cleaning, and it made the cost of going to college less than half of what it would have been had I stayed in the dormitory. And with there being only 32 of us and eating our meals together, there was a real sense of community. But that was also a smaller arena for me to move from the more remote kind of thing into the college scene as if I had been, for example, in a dormitory that had several hundred students in it.
This was in the early to mid 60s.
Right, 1960 was my freshman year, graduated in 1964.
This was also the period that the sit-ins that started, Freedom Riders would make that journey. Here in Birmingham and others that would be selected by the campaigns, and then Birmingham, the demonstrations in '63. How did that impact upon your environment at the time?
Not all that much. I really was not particularly sensitive to social issues, I guess you would term. The situation in Arkansas, Governor Falpus, I remember that making an impression on me. And again, it was kind of one disbelief that people really did those kind of things, but remote enough. I remember the bombing of the church, but one, we didn't subscribe to a newspaper, we didn't have a television. Generally, when we listened to the radio, it was more entertainment shows, and we didn't really listen to the radio that much. So, up until I went to college was.
So it was very isolated.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Our poverty wasn't as bad as, for example, what you would have found in Appalachia, but we had many of the dynamics of rural poverty.
Right. When you arrived on campus and you saw all of these other people come in with different kinds of ideas and cultures, how did that impact upon this young woman who's coming from rural Missouri, and probably meeting people from the cities, the inner cities, all around the country? How did that impact it?
Yeah, it really, I don't think there were many from inner city situations.
So there were not many black kids.
Well, there were a number, but they, were very much academically, achieving in terms of being in classes. I don't really remember what the percentage was. It would have been a very small percentage because there was not a high ratio of African American individuals. I really don't know what Kansas City was at that particular point.
Right.
The 2 African American people that I knew best both came from Kansas City, but that was kind of the extent of it.
So what was your major?
Elementary education.
Elementary education. Mm-hmm. So you aspired to go into the classroom.
Right.
After college, what did you do?
Well, there are a couple things that happened in college that we might want to make reference to. I'm Baptist, and one of the things that our denomination had at that particular time, I'm not sure whether they still do or not, was called a Better Speakers Tournament, where you were given a selected list of topics that you could develop. I don't remember how many minutes, 7 minutes, 8 minutes, 10 minutes, something like that. And you could compete on the associational level, which was kind of the county, and then there was a state competition, and the winners of the state competition went to Ridgecrest, North Carolina, which is where one of the two national conference centers for the Southern Baptist denomination are located. And I entered that speakers contest and went on to win the state contest, which meant I would go to Ridgecrest. And I was working in girls auxiliary camps. The girls organization and our denomination was called Girls Auxiliary. And during my summers in college, I worked in GA camps, primarily ones that needed some outside help if there was going to be a camping experience for kids. And so I didn't have to be back in Missouri for camp until Monday, and I finished in North Carolina on Wednesday. So I decided this would be a chance to travel through the South and see what that was like. My main interest there being denominational. The Baptist Home Mission Board is in Atlanta. Women's Missionary Union is here in Birmingham, and I had met people from both of those I was very active in the Baptist Student Union on campus. And at that point, I was thinking about seminary as possibly an option, so I was going to go to Atlanta and visit the people I knew at the Home Mission Board, come to Birmingham and visit Billy Pate and Elaine Dixon, and visit the seminary in New Orleans and head back. And again, I'm straight off the farm, okay? So I rode to Atlanta with a group from LaGrange, Georgia, and we got in, it was probably at 8, 9 o'clock at night, and I had to think I would go find a hotel or a motel and go down the Home Mission Board the next morning. Well, here were all these homeless people and various people kind of sitting around on the curb, and I believed I would just stay in the bus station all night because I was afraid to go out. The next morning, as I asked where there was a restaurant or a place to get some breakfast, and they gave me directions, and it was also the direction of the Home Mission Board. So as I rounded the corner to go to the restaurant, a group of black people were being loaded onto this semi-trailer truck. I mean, it had a low thing that there had been a sit-in at this restaurant, and they had been arrested and were being carted off. So I believed I wasn't hungry for breakfast and went on to the Home Mission Board, visited people, came on to Birmingham, and the Greyhound bus station was just through Women's Missionary Union at that time, was located at the corner of 20th Street and 6th Avenue North. And so it was not long until 5 o'clock, so I went ahead and left my luggage at the bus station to walk on up to Women's Missionary Union to meet Billy and Elaine. Well, they invited me to spend the night with them. So we couldn't find a parking place, so Billy was going to drive around the block while I went in and get my suitcase. And in front of me in line was a black lady who had a child probably 2.5, 3 years old, and one that she was carrying in arms. And the man at the bus where you got the luggage told her to step aside.
Just a white man or black man?
A white man. And I said, but was in front of me in line. And he said, she's a dirty nigger, she can wait. And I said, no, she was in line. Now, this really was not, I did not see it as a racial situation. I simply been taught when somebody was in front of you in line,
This was not a demonstration
right.
of any sort.
No, it was, again, I'm pure naive off of the farm. So, never occurred to me here, I'm college age individual who obviously does not have a Southern accent in a bus station in 1963. And it turned out the guy had a button that he could push to notify the police that something was going on at the bus station. The next thing we knew, 5 carloads of police officers descended upon the bus station.
What year was this?
Summer of 1963.
Oh, well, sure. Yes.
Would have been in June. I'm not sure.
Demonstrations just
Right.
finished. Yes.
Right. Fortunately, Billy and Lane had found a parking place by this time and couldn't figure out why it was taking me so long to get my luggage, and came in and, identified that yes, I was with them, that I would be in their presence while I was in Birmingham. So they had to sign a paper that, that they would be my caretakers while I was, and the next morning, I had to notify the police department that I was leaving town, and there was a police officer standing there to see me get on the bus and head on my way.
Mm-hmm.
So then I just couldn't believe this. I was just, blew my mind, so to speak. So then we stopped in Mississippi, and I remember the town. It was a small place, and I had gone to the restroom first, and when I came out the lunch counter, all the seats were filled except one. There were 2 seats at the end of the counter, and a young white man was sitting in one of them, and then there was this vacant seat. So I go sit down, and the waitress says to me, "If you don't move, I want to have you arrested."
Talking to you.
Yes. And
Was this the black counter? Was it
No.
just because you were sitting next to
Right.
her?
I said, "Well, I don't know what I'm doing wrong." And she said, "Well, we may not be able to keep the niggers from sitting at the lunch counter. So we passed an ordinance that whites can't sit by them when they're at the lunch counter."
Mm-hmm.
So I got up and believed I wasn't hungry for lunch.
Mm-hmm.
And, after the Atlanta, Birmingham, and Mississippi experience, I believed I was ready to head on back to Missouri. I rode to New Orleans, got off the bus, got me a ticket to Missouri, and headed to Missouri and said I'd never come back to the South again.
And that was it. What were the responses when you got back to Missouri to tell people about your experiences?
I didn't talk about it. One, for my parents to be aware that I had been in that kind of danger would not have gone over well.
Mm-hmm.
And I had learned fairly early it was better that they knew some things and not other things. So I really didn't talk to anybody about it.
Mm-hmm. So you then finished up at your college in 64. What did you do after?
Went to seminary at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Fort Worth.
Fort Worth, Texas.
Mm-hmm.
And you were there for what, 2 years?
Yes.
What was the atmosphere like in Fort Worth at that time?
Yeah, we were pretty isolated. I was financially having a very hard time, so I generally, other than going to church, did not go off the campus the first year. That we had a cafeteria on campus and one thing and another. There were I want to say 2 or 3 African American students that were not from overseas, and then there were several from various countries in Africa. But they represented a pretty small group and were very well accepted on the campus. Mm-hmm. Then my second year, I took a social work class, and part of the requirements of that class was that you had to do some practical experience kinds of things. And the Tarrant Baptist Association had a mission center in one of the public housing communities. And so I spent some time working. That was really my first introduction to inner city poverty.
You had majored in elementary education. Why did you determine that you would go to seminary rather than going to teach right after school?
I felt called by God to go into a church-related vocation. My expectation was that, I think I made reference a while ago that the program in our denomination for young girls is called Girls Auxiliary, and that I would become a Girls Auxiliary director of some state, or in some way work with WU, that would take advantage of my elementary background. I mean, elementary age kids was what I really enjoyed working with. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of what I expected my vocation to evolve into.
Mm-hmm. How did this first experience within a city, how did that impact upon you?
I don't think I really would have been able to have verbalized what bothered me at that particular point, but it was really a unsettling experience in that it was a very paternalistic program, in which I felt like the staff people wasn't exactly that they looked down on the people in the community, but
You just got a feeling that.
yeah, and I ended up not working there any more than was required for this particular class because there was just something about it that didn't settle right with me. And I hadn't been exposed to any other models that might have helped me know that, yeah, there are other ways of doing these kind of things. So, but that was my first experience in terms, the inner city poverty didn't particularly bother me. Again, I think I pretty much identified. By this time, I realized that I had been poor when I was growing up. I think there was probably some identification there.
So you were there in Fort Worth for 2 years. After your 2 years stint and you were finishing up seminary, and what?
I mentioned a while ago that the national headquarters of Women's Missionary Union is here in Birmingham, and in January, before I graduated in May, they offered me a position here as the national director for the Young Women's Auxiliary, which was for individuals, young women 16 to 24 years of age, and that meant coming to live in Birmingham.
Is that young white women or young women period?
No, it's white women.
And when you got this offer to come to Birmingham, what were you thinking about?
Well, the racial asset, I just don't know whether I want to live in Birmingham or not. And they said, well, a lot of progress has been made. Actually, one of the leaders on the white adult side in Birmingham was a Mrs. McMurray, who was the executive director of Women's Missionary Union just prior to this time, I think in the 50s on into the early 60s. She died very unexpectedly with a heart attack, I want to say 2 or 3 years before I came to Birmingham, so I never had the chance to meet her. But I heard many stories of her going to some interracial meetings where she was spit upon as she would go in and come out by white individuals. So Women's Missionary Union saw itself to be, primarily because of Ms. McMurray and her involvement in the Birmingham racial situation, saw themselves to be very progressive in terms of those kind of issues.
So when you arrived in Birmingham, and of course I'm sure you were thinking about what had taken place, how did you deal with that situation of making yourself comfortable with the decision that you had made to come to Birmingham?
It really wasn't all that bad because in terms of Ms. McMurray's leadership, I felt that Women's Missionary Union was an acceptable kind of thing. I was very excited and challenged by the need to come straight out of seminary and be the national director. Was certainly an honor to be. In fact, I was the first person that they hired who had not been a state level person before coming to the national office. Also, my job involved a lot of travel, so I actually was in Birmingham very little.
Around the state?
I traveled in the United States.
What community did you move into?
The summer, I moved here in June of 1996, and for that summer,
1966.
66, right? And that summer lived in a room in a house in Eastlake. And a friend of mine from seminary had been in summer mission work in Washington State, and we had planned for a good while. She was going to be teaching school at A.G. Gaston Junior High.
Oh, is that right? Yes. Yes,
I think, yeah.
In Brownville,
Right.
Roosevelt City.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And that once she got back from summer missions, that we would get an apartment together and live together. And we ended up living in Homewood, close to where Lakeshore Drive and Green Springs Highway come together.
What churches you attend?
Joined First Baptist Church. And the reason I joined First Baptist, when I was in seminary, took a class on ministry in metropolitan areas. And interestingly, that would have been 1966, because it was the last semester I was there. And it was the first class that had been offered in a Southern Baptist seminary on urban ministry.
Is that right?
Which, now it just blows my mind, but, but this was the best class I ever took in seminary. The teacher was exciting. We researched creative and innovative ministries and churches of all denominations throughout the United States, and just really turned me on to the inner city. I mean, it was kind of from that point on that the inner city situation was where there was much more opportunity for creative things and new ideas and to try things out than the traditional suburban situation.
So when you got here in Birmingham, you didn't waste too much time. You got involved in the community.
Right.
What kinds of activities were you initially involved in?
Well, I guess the first and one most significant was one of the things that Women's Missionary was producing was called Mission Action Guides. And there was one on internationals, one on juvenile delinquency, and one on non-readers. Well, first I worked on one for economically disadvantaged. And then I was assigned to work on one for non-readers. And to make a long story short, in the process of unloading those mission action guides off of the truck into our storage area, realized that our janitor, who was helping unload materials, could not read anything that was on the side of the boxes. And I thought, okay, here I am sitting behind my desk, writing materials going all over the United States on non-readers, and here's somebody in my own building.
What made you realize you couldn't read?
He asked me something, I don't remember the exact question, but it was something about what was printed on the side of the box. And I kind of, it took me a second to figure out why he didn't know, because it was right there in front of me. And it actually was a little bit after that I realized that, hey, Mr. Gooden couldn't read what was there. So I talked to some of the people in my church and found 4 or 5 other people who were kind of interested in a literacy ministry. Contacted our home mission board in Atlanta, and they identified a lady living in Birmingham who was trained to teach the Bock literacy method. So I began then in the time that I was in Birmingham, during my lunch hours, began teaching him to read and write. And that led into a significant experience in that he had 9 children, and all but one got college educations, and even though he was a non-reader. He had prided himself that he had never used any form of public assistance. I mean, this was really a big thing to him. And his daughter Patricia's husband had a spell in which he suffered from amnesia, and they ended up finding him in Mobile. He didn't know where he was or who he was, and she had 3 children. And he was trying to financially support her and her family during Anthony's illness, and decided that he was going to have to apply for food stamps. And so I told him that I would be glad to go with him to apply for food stamps. And the food stamp center, you had to walk down this alley and go in a side door, which gave you a great sense of dignity and respect. So it turned out they were closed during lunch, so we waited until they came back. We were the first people in. 3 or 4 white applicants came in after we did, and we sat there as a social worker would come, pick up a file, look out over the group, put the file down, pick up another one, and all of the white people were called for service before we were. So finally our name was called, and I'm not sure how the caseworker became aware that he was not able to write his name. At that point, if he saw his name written out, he could write it, but he hadn't completely learned to spell it. So the worker pushed the paper around and said, okay, go ahead and put your OX down here. And I said, he can write his name. And got a piece of paper out of the wastebasket and wrote his name out and gave him the pen, and he signed his name. Well, this was just a tremendously emotional experience. One, it was the first time I had experienced the prejudice that he had experienced in terms of, I knew exactly what was happening with those folders. So as we went out, we were walking back, and I was just struggling with, what do I say? And finally I said, all I can say is, I'm sorry, and for the first time I understand. And, and it was, the bond which we felt together was just tremendous. Well, the very next day, again, the WU building was at the corner of 20th Street and 6th Avenue, and the Food Stamp Center would have been at 22nd between 8th and 9th Avenues North. The next day, I heard some commotion around lunchtime down on the street and looked out, and a group of African American individuals were having a march on the Food Stamp Center. And tears just streamed down my face because for the first time again, I knew what, and again, it was only one small experience for me where it was much of their, but that proved to be a very, very pivotal point in my.
I had efforts to desegregate churches, to integrate churches. Where did First Baptist, what was First Baptist role in?
Back in, I'm not sure the year, but the pastor's name was Earl Stallings. And I'm not sure whether it was in the 50s or the 60s. I almost want to say it was more like 59, 58, 59, 60, somewhere. Right, and there were a group of African American individuals who came to the service, and Dr. Stallings invited them in. They were seated and did participate in the service, and there was a good bit of national publicity of Dr. Stallings standing at the door, shaking hands, and in a welcoming stance.
Right.
But that had been some time earlier.
Yes. So by the time that you got there, were there black members of First Baptist?
No.
Were there blacks that attended
No.
periodically?
Well, not until the tutoring program incident came about.
Okay. Were there ever any difficulties between people within the church to accept blacks, like visitors, or?
Well, there weren't any.
There were none.
Right.
Okay. So
There were not any until February of 1970.
Okay. Okay. All right. You were also involved with something in Central City, Metropolitan Garden.
Right, that's all part of the same
Okay.
same episode.
Okay. At that point, Metropolitan Garden was predominantly white.
All white.
All white. Okay. How did that change take place? What was going on?
Well, in 1968, the pastor, who was Dr. James Landis, announced his resignation, that he was going to Richardson, Texas. And he was the 5th pastor in 12 years to resign. And the church panicked.
This is First Baptist?
Right. And so a group of the male leadership went to Dr. Landis and said, if you will stay, we will give leadership to the church moving to the suburbs. And to show their commitment to do this, they took an option on a piece of property that I think is where Brookwood Baptist Church is now. I'm not 100% that was the exact site, but it was be located in Mountain Brook. I'm pretty sure it was that site. Well, he went ahead and left anyway. Well, they had the option on the land, I want to say for 3 or 4 months before they had to put any money down. So the committee was appointed, and one of the things they did was to visit the Oakhurst Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia, who had saved money to build a new sanctuary and came to decide to make repairs on the sanctuary and to stay in the community and develop ministries with that community. And they were so touched by this experience that the committee came back and worded what became known as the 68 commitments, which were to stay downtown, to welcome all who would come, learned or unlearned, rich or poor. It did not use the terminology black and white. The committee felt like if those terms were used, it would not pass. And they were wanting to buy time, that they felt the statement was strong enough that it could be used to get a new pastor who was oriented to ministry in the community and kind of give some time to try to bring individuals along. So those commitments were passed. And at this time, I was still working at Women's Missionary Union and served as volunteer, what we call a youth coordinator, that I couldn't teach a Sunday school class because I was out of town too much. So I could plan youth activities when I was going to be in town. You know, we could have a retreat, we could have Sunday night fellowships and stuff. So the evening of the day that we voted the 68 commitments, we had a youth fellowship, and the kids were all turned on and said, is there something youth can do about this, or is this another adult only? And I said, well, why don't a group of us go down and talk to the principal of Powell Elementary School and see what his, so I took 6 of the young people down there. I've forgotten his first name, but Mr. Starr was his last name. Of course, the first thing he suggested was a tutoring program. The kids said, yeah, we can do that. And that fall was the time that, I guess it was during the summer, that the first black families moved into what was then Central City, now Metropolitan Gardens. So we began a tutoring program on Monday and Wednesday afternoons with kids from Central City. The new pastor, Dr. J. Herbert Gilmore, arrived, I want to say September. It was almost exactly at the same time we started the tutoring program. And the first Wednesday night that the tutoring kids came, some of the adult members of the church came for Wednesday night church activities and saw these black children and became incensed and went to the new pastor and said, you're to stop this. And he said, no, my understanding, one of the things I had done, and I didn't really know why I did it, but it was a wise move, I had actually presented it to the deacons to vote on and had it voted on at church that we start this ministry. So Dr. Gilmore's response was, the church voted to do this. I can't, as a pastor, change something that the church voted to do. So things kind of leveled off. Interestingly enough, that Sunday school class was called the Cosmopolitan Sunday School class. So in the second Sunday in February, 12 of our tutoring children showed up for Sunday school, and 14 teachers resigned rather than teach those children. But we had them all, the teachers all replaced by the next Sunday, so the children didn't know that they had created a problem. Then in April of 1970, Winfred, Brian, and Twyla visited the church for the first time. And, you know, at the time, not knowing what was ahead, made special effort to keep her visitor's card. We now have, I recently was going through some things and came across, we have framed on our new sanctuary. But they came. Then in May, they presented themselves for membership. Now, the bylaws of the church stated if a prospective member was objected to, it was to be referred to the deacons and pastor to determine if the objections were scriptural and valid. So Dr. Gilmore ruled that it had to be a stated objection. It couldn't just be X number of people raising their hands saying that they objected, because in order to determine if it was scriptural and valid, it had to be a stated objection. So finally, one of the men said, well, I will state my objection to the deacons. I won't state it to this whole congregation. So Dr. Gilmore accepted that. The deacons meeting was the next night. And his objection was that her motivation was wrong, that she was coming just to make trouble. And it ended up that the deacons voted 17 to 13, take it back, 16 to 14 to recommend Ms. Bryant for membership, and 17 to 13, one person changed their vote when they came to vote on the child. So as it happened, the Baptist World Alliance was being held in Tokyo, Japan, and the church, months before this, had voted to send Dr. Gilmore, and he was going to take a 6-week tour of various countries all the way back. So a decision was made that they not be presented for membership until Dr. Gilmore got back from his trip. So then towards the end of June, there was a church conference in which the segregationists had completely organized themselves. This was the first time they began bringing in people from nursing homes, people who hadn't been to the church for years, to try to control votes. Like they had an alternative slate of deacons. Am I taking too long?
No.
Okay. They had an alternative slate of deacons who were all segregationist people. And the final motion was that Dr. Gilmore and I be fired immediately, that I have 24 hours to clean out my office, and that when he got back from Japan, would have 24 hours to clean out his office. And the vote there was a 2-vote margin that, motion was made by Judge H.H. Brooms, who was the one who ruled in the Andrew Lucy case with George Wallace, stood and recommended that the motion be tabled because it was not only un-Christian to fire somebody when they weren't there to answer the charges against them, it was also un-American. And the un-American helped us, the un-Christian, wouldn't have gotten us anywhere, but the un-American. And so by a 2-vote margin, ended up not being fired that night. Let me back up, I forgot something significant. The day that the 12 tutoring children came to Sunday school, and totally unconnected in terms of their timing, the following Monday was to be a desegregation deadline for the Birmingham school system. And there were a group of white citizens who had organized themselves as parents concerned, who were opposing the integration of the schools. And that Sunday afternoon, there was a big Parents Concern rally at the Municipal Auditorium with George Wallace speaking. He wanted to make the point that if we let blacks in, they will simply try to take over, and said, why just this morning a group of black people tried to take over fine old First Baptist Church, 12 tutoring kids. But that propelled our situation into the John Birchers became involved, the Wallace's people became involved, a little bit of Klan. We were never able to really document a lot of Klan involvement. But it was at that particular point that threats began to be made. Much of it focused on Dr. Gilmore and myself, particularly going on until after Ms. Bryant Twala presented themselves for membership. Probably the most creative threat that each of us got was a drawing of a gun, but where the thing is, where you cock it, the barrel was coming out there, so if you pull the trigger, you shot yourself. The church was, bomb threats were called in twice, that we had to vacate the church.
On Sunday mornings?
No, they were both Wednesday night activities. At the first time that I got a threat in the night that my car was going to have a bomb in it, I went out the next morning, and the air had been let out about halfway on the tires of my car. And the gas cap was missing and the little flat thing was open. So it was enough to know that somebody had been messing with my car. So I called the Homewood Police and asked them if they would come check my car for a bomb. So the officers wanted to know what I was involved in, that somebody might want to put a bomb in my car. And I said, well, I'm involved in the First Baptist Church situation. To which the guy looked at me and just kind of put his face up against mine and said, if you're a dirty nigger lover, you deserve what you get. I hope you won't bother us again. So I knew that I could not rely on the Homewood Police to provide any protection or help for me. So, that became a pretty significant dynamic there. They would do things such as make it obvious that they were following me home. The scariest one came one night. The parking lot was over to one side of the apartments, and there were 2 or 3 men leaning against the trunk of their cars. There was a man on each side of my door just leaning up against the wall. They never laid a hand on me, but to walk past them after, first of all, knowing I was being followed, and to walk past them to get to my apartment was a pretty scary thing, particularly knowing that I could not count on the Homewood Police for any help at that particular point. The thing I think that got, the thing that got to Dr. Gilmore and I the most, for him, he had a 9-year-old daughter, and the calls that his daughter would be harmed were the ones that gave him greatest pause. The threats to rape me were the ones that I really didn't think they would kill me. But there was a real degree to which I expected to be raped before the whole situation was over. So that was more the fear I lived with than being killed.
Trying times. Did you ever have any physical difficulties with anyone?
No, they never touched me.
You had the opportunity to either meet or hear President Pitts from Miles.
Yes. Okay, that comes a bit later. After this, the motion had been made that be tabled whether Dr. Gilmore and I would be fired or not.
Right.
He got back 1st of August, and the church conference to decide whether they were going to fire us or not lasted 8 hours, went until 2:30 in the morning. And finally, by a 4-vote margin, we doubled over the last time, they voted not to fire us. So then Ms. Bryant and Twyla were presented for membership on September 27th of 1970. The bylaw stated if objection had been raised to somebody in regard to someone, it then took a 2/3 vote, not a simple majority, for that person to be accepted. So when the vote was taken, we had a majority vote, but we did not have the 2/3 vote. Interestingly, Baptists pride themselves so much on abiding by the vote of the majority. In actuality, both times, the majority of the people voted to accept them. But the first time, objection was raised, which threw out the majority vote. And in the second case, a 2/3 requirement was not reached as compared to a simple majority. So Dr. Gilmore and I resigned immediately. And Dr. Byrne Williamson stood and suggested that all who agreed with Dr. Gilmore and I that this stance was unchristian and unethical to go with him to the education building to close the service in prayer. And at that point, approximately 300 people got up and walked out of the service in protest of that. This group had already had a few meetings with the name of the Company of the Committed. Elton Trueblood, about that time, had written a book by the name of the Company of the Committed. And Dr. Williamson had been touched by this book, and that's kind of how that name came about. And as it happened, there had been a cover dish lunch planned for the noon meal of the day that the walkout took place. So we gathered in the basement in the dining hall, and Dr. Williams said, just anybody who wants to say anything at this point, the floor is open. And the one I remember the most was this lady who had to be in her 80s, Miss Edney, stood and said, I just want to say, I've been a member of this church for, I want to say, 55 years. I mean, just incredible. And this is the greatest day in my life. Part of what interested about her was she taught one of the elderly women's Sunday school classes. And in one of the business meetings, she had taken a very strong stance and quoted scripture in terms of the brotherhood and sisterhood of all people. And her Sunday school class had gotten up and walked out on her that Sunday. Well, we had one teacher in youth division. In the meantime, I had left Women's Missionary Union and come on the staff of First Baptist. I'd forgotten to say that in there. We had one teacher in the youth division who was not open to the African American people coming in, so she resigned. So the 11th and 12th grade youth voted to have Ms. Edney to come be their Sunday school teacher. So, I mean, that was just one of the really neat experiences and all that. So finally, Dr. Williamson said, we've got to see whether we're going to have the resources to form a church or where we go from here. So in terms of what kind of money we can look at to operate with, I'd like for you to just tear off a piece of your bulletin or somewhere and write down how much money you think you can commit to the formation of a new church. And so people just, there was no printed cards or things, you just tore off what you had. And I forgot what the amount was. I want to say it was in the range of $100,000 was committed that day. And the feeling was, yes, we can move forward then with forming a church. Dr. Gilmore and I both offered our resignations as of November the 1st, feeling that a 30-day, is appropriate. It became an issue because it turned out that November 1 was a Sunday, and were our resignations effective at 12:01 a.m. or 11:59 p.m. because we determined whether we were going to be there for that service or not. So we made our resignations effective October 31st. I specified in mine 11:59 p.m. because we had developed a coffee house ministry that was just going great, and if it was 11:59 p.m., we could keep the coffee house open one more night. So we began to search for a place to have our worship service, and we contacted several churches, most of them in the downtown South Side area, and we were told by some that their church could split over whether or not to let us use their facility or not. So we decided that we would discontinue approaching people. It was obvious from the news media that we were in need of a place to worship. And finally, on the Wednesday night before November 1, it was worked out for us to use the Birmingham Baptist Association, which at the time was at 20th Street and 8th Avenue South. So we had our first service together on November the 1st. And the next couple of weeks came up with a name, decided that we were going to incorporate, and we wanted to put the executive director of the Alabama Baptist Convention in a stance of being supportive. And we proposed a couple dates to him, and as well, now he already has. So finally, Dr. Gilmore said, "Will you tell us the date that you're free, and we'll set the thing for that." So on the 21st of December, 1970, we incorporated and were dedicated as a church. And the gentleman from the Alabama Baptist Convention got up and went great lengths saying, now, I can only represent one person. I'm not here to represent Alabama Baptist. Well, I can't even represent my wife. Dr. Lucian Pitts came right after Dr. Bagley and stood and said, "I just want to say what indeed an honor it is to stand here and represent the 300,000 Black individuals of our community." And the contrast was just beautiful. I mean, that is one of the most wonderful moments of my whole life as Dr. Pitts stood and he said, I jotted down some notes, but, I want to speak from the heart at this particular point. And there was not a dry eye in that place when he finished.
What was his topic? What did he talk about?
He really didn't have a title as such. He just spoke of the pilgrimage of the Black community and made reference to a few of his experiences as a Black person growing up and the call to be brothers and sisters. It was somewhat general. And then the sermon was delivered by Dr. Bill Hull, who has been at Samford University more recently. And he used the same approach that Susan de Dietrich in her book, The Witnessing Community, in terms of the called out remnant that remained faithful to God throughout the history and blended the forming of covenant into that chain of biblical remnant group who were called out to be faithful to God. So that was a great day. Then some of the pastors and the association began circulating petitions that we not be able to use the Baptist building. So Rabbi Grafman, who at that time was Rabbi at Temple Manuel, called and said, "We understand you all need a place to worship in the synagogue. Would love for you to share our facilities." So for 2.5 years, we worshiped at Temple Manuel. They had Hebrew school on Sunday mornings, so we had 5 different places in a several block area of Temple Manuel where we had Sunday school classes. The Dale Carnegie House was there. They let us use some space. Campfire Girls was in the area, let us use their space. We rented some space in an office building that was used for the nursery because in terms of trying to take down and put up nursery equipment, we needed place where we could keep stuff. So your family might be having Sunday school in 4 different places on Sunday morning.
You have been active in the community participation movement, as we say. What have been some of the highlights of your career with that group? I know you serve as, are you still president?
No.
Of the association?
I gave up being president in 1987 or 88. Yes, I was asked to work with the Woodlawn area and revitalization program, and the time and the evening meetings of my own neighborhood association and the need to meet with folks in Woodlawn was just too much of a conflict because I really felt like they both had to be my first priority. So I went ahead and did not run in 87 or 88 to continue as president.
You were here when Mary was first in office.
Right.
How did your community respond to a Black man coming in to run the city?
My recollection is that he carried our neighborhood. A number of us who were very active in the neighborhood movement were very active in support of his campaign, and that's a long time ago. But my recollection is that we had a majority.
Then how do you see the city changing over time from when you arrived here in '66 to the present, as far as race relations are concerned?
Outwardly, there has been progress.
What do you mean outward? Explain that.
Racism is still alive and well.
Why do you say that?
It's seen in housing patterns. The transition that's taking place in Huffman, Roebuck area now. For a long time, folks could hide behind the economic thing. Well, now if there were middle-class black people, we wouldn't mind living next door to them. It's, the low-income black that we don't want to live next door to. But now you have African-American middle-class families moving into previously white communities, and you've got as much white flight as when it was the inner city. I would even put some of the difficulties with programs such as Healthy Start and some of the stuff with the citizen participation program. I think have some vestiges of those dynamics.
How is that? Those two, just talk just briefly about those two, Healthy Start and citizen participation.
In some ways, I would say the two groups of people in many situations could use the same words and think they were on the same page, but the reality was that they were poles apart. And I don't put the whole Healthy Start situation on them. I mean, there was one woman who, apart from anything else, was a primary factor in the things that happened, but that wasn't the sole problem going on.
We've covered a lot of territory, and we're going to have to stop here because I have another person that's coming in. I'm sure, though, that we're going to probably like to get you back to talk more in detail about some of the things that have taken place, in the last 10 or 12 years. But I want to thank you for taking time out today to come and talk with me.
Thank you.